Thank you so much, David. I must say it's an honor to be here, and it was a great honor to have been invited to participate in this first conference that David has organized, and I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here. After hearing Jürgen Moltmann this morning, I repaired to the lunchroom and wrote a new introduction to what I'm going to talk about today. I felt inspired to be a bit more personal in my comments. So what I've got really is sort of a two-part presentation, which I hope will be provocative of questions and discussions. I certainly look forward to entering into a dialogue with you all. But I really feel like it's important to sort of to ground what I have to say in some personal remarks, in a bit of my own background that goes beyond simply my resume. And that is to say that when I first began work in journalism, and I spent a little more than 2 decades specifically in the area of newspapers, print journalism, that I was well aware that I was entering a profession that, for some, is under suspicion, that people have some reservations about. And at the same time, it has this double identity of being, the news media, of being both suspect and at the same time vital. Because it, of course, is the source of so much of our information about the world. And for me, in particular, as a child in the 1960s and adolescent in the 1970s, it was aspects of the news media, particularly newspapers, that really did shape my worldview and shape me as a citizen by providing information to me about so much that was happening in the country and in the world. For me personally, I grew up at the time of the Vietnam War and also Watergate, and the way the news media reported those issues, particularly major newspapers and network television, was very important for me just in terms of coming to understand the world in which I lived. Upon entering journalism, though, I want to say that it became clear to me that there are at least 4 points that I learned right away and that were important. One is that the profession, that is, of someone working within the news media, is opaque to many people on the outside. There are many questions about how journalists go about their work, which are valid questions, and yet from inside, one assumes that this is known. One assumes that the profession is well enough known that it should be obvious. Of course, it isn't. 2, one thing that I continue to wrestle with, and that certainly developed during my career, is the way in which I would define what is the news media is not the way in which other people would define that term. For one thing, the definition in general shifted tremendously during the 20-some years that I was professionally employed as a journalist. 3, news, and this may be obvious, but I found myself always learning the obvious as I was a reporter, is that news is not gathered in a vacuum, but is subject, and the gatherer subject to many pressures, many conflicting pressures from the outside. And 4, it's a lonely business. And that is something that one really can't know until one's in it. And in loneliness lies a certain danger, and that's something that I want to go into in my remarks. For 16 of the 21 years that I worked as a journalist, I reported mainly on the subject of religion in the United States, an enormous, enormous subject that engaged me in a truly passionate way. And part of that passion was my belief that I was performing a service, at least at my best, in terms of trying to explain to the readers of the newspapers at which I worked that I regarded religion as being fundamentally part of the American culture, and that American culture and also American history really couldn't be understood apart from an appreciation of the role that religion plays in the lives of individuals and also in the spirit of institutions. Two, I always felt that I was trying to explain that to people within the news media, that my role was both external and also internal. And so I was sort of driven by this sense of service. At the same time, and as part of that too, I wanted to go against what I regarded as a sort of a two-part conventional wisdom within the news media. And that is that religion, anything about religion, would be restricted to a certain section on a certain day. That is a Saturday page. And two, that a person who wrote about religion had to be ordained as a clergyman, as so many at one time were. I am not. But I really believe that there could be a place for a layperson, in my case, a Protestant Christian layperson who was active, actually, is active in his religious life, that there was a place for such a person within the general media writing on this subject, and yet able and determined to listen and try to understand the experience of others regardless of the situation and the beliefs out of which they came. And this is sort of a delicate thing, I think, to go into because it's not easily understood sort of in the wider situation of the news media. And I'm happy to go into that more later if we want to, although I by no means want this to be, to be about me or all about me. I'm sort of moving on to our larger subject here. If I had a mission statement that became sort of developed within my own experience as a journalist, it was this: that regardless of what one did in terms of going into a particular story, attempting to tell a story, deal with an issue, that one always went in with an open mind, that is, being prepared to be surprised and to learn. Two, one always had to be open about one's intent. That is, when dealing with people, tell them what it is that one had come to do, what it is one wanted, and to ask basic questions. Indeed, that was my third point, that one should always be prepared to ask basic questions and not hesitate to repeat those questions until one had an idea what it was that was at the heart of the people with which one dealt. And four, to keep people informed, the people with whom I dealt in context of a story. There was a relationship that was explicit in interviewing someone, my interviewing someone. That was a relationship. And I felt, particularly as time went on, as if I had an obligation to let them know how I heard them. So after interviewing them, or maybe at the scene, if there was a very short amount of time involved, often what I'd do is I would read back their quotes to them. I'd say, "I heard you say this to me." And in some ways it was a form of courtesy. But on the other hand, I wanted to be sure that I heard them right. Now, I had enough confidence in myself to think that I did, and I was not offering people a chance to rewrite, but I was offering them a chance to explain if they needed to. And I can tell you in 99% of the cases in which I did that, and it got to be a habit, people said, "Yeah, that's what I said." Okay. And in the other 1%, it was, "Yes, but when I said this, what I really meant was X," because there can be times when one says something that will sound ambiguous, and you do need to explain it. And I didn't want to be in a position of going back and sitting down on deadline at my desk, writing something where I realized there was ambiguity in what the person said, in which case, chances are I would simply have to drop that out. But I might be dropping something that was quite vital. In this way, I strove for, how to describe it, accuracy, fairness, balance. I hesitate to use those latter two words because there's a news organization that has tried to trademark them. And they've become almost cliches. But I was striving for something. And what could that have been? thinking back to what Professor Moltmann said this morning, well, perhaps it was a form of control, but maybe it was a form of self-control. It was checking, was what it was, fact-checking. Sort of fact-checking against my own capacity for error and other people's capacity for perhaps speaking loosely against what they might have meant. I don't hold myself up as a model for anyone else. I'm simply saying, I'm talking about the process that I used. That's all. And I felt that it worked for me. What I was trying to do was build some sort of trust between myself and the people with whom I dealt, between myself and my readers. I hope, as I say, that this has some broader application, that I'm not speaking too narrowly about one field and one person in that field. But I think I can go on and try to expand this a bit. Within journalism, spin is a very ugly word. It is a terrible word. And it is something you neither want to do nor do you want to have it done to you. It's not a word that you want to link with your colleagues or former colleagues. There are occasions in which I have, at least in my mind, saying that person was spun. When a journalist is spun, that is, provided either with an outright lie or a set of facts so limited as to promote only a single point of view, then it's as if a contagion has been introduced into an institution, the news media, which will be debilitated eventually as a result. Spin is like a computer virus in the destructiveness of its effect, but more so because the repair from spin is a far greater task than the reconstruction of computer files. In other words, it's not a technical problem that one deals with. It involves the work of course, rebuilding trust, which is exceptionally difficult, I think. Why is it difficult? Well, we've got to consider the cultural context in which we operate. And I speak of the cultural context that has been operative, at least as long as I've been an adult, and that is in which we see repeated examples of powerful interests committing fraud against the public for very short-term gains. Political, financial, and religious leaders have failed us in one way or another, often spectacularly, and particularly so in the last few years. I mean, if you just think about the instances of scandal or something approaching scandal, whether we're talking about Enron, whether we're talking about various Roman Catholic bishops, or whether we're talking about the intelligence services in the United States. There's sort of this repeated instances of failure of the public. And amidst all this, a persistent suspicion falls on people in the news media, which is understood correctly as a powerful institution, albeit, and this is one of my points, a very decentralized one, in which the forms of media have changed and expanded very much over the past 2 decades. I teach an advanced newspaper reporting class this fall at Syracuse University, and on Wednesday afternoon, I took my students down to the city police station. I'm introducing them to various institutions of local government and government services this fall and talking about how to report on them. It's very elementary, and this is the way young reporters come into the business. And we had a very helpful detective sergeant who clearly enjoys interacting with students. Perhaps he's a frustrated teacher, who was wonderful and told us everything we needed to know about the layout of the police station and the different branches of the police force in Syracuse. He was just great. But his presentation impressed me not only for that, for its technical aspects, but for how he ended it, and that was with a blunt word of caution. Trust has got to be earned, he told these students. Don't burn your sources. In other words, he well knew that as aspiring newspaper reporters, they would depend for their livelihoods on being able to obtain accurate information of as much quality as possible. He could provide that as the police department spokesperson, and would to progressively greater degrees as he became familiar with individual reporters. But if he felt his confidence was somehow being abused, especially if a reporter took something that he said was not ready for publication, if it was spoken off the record, and in fact published it, then he would cut the person off. He would feel burned. It was good, very good for my students to hear that, and I shook his hand afterwards, particularly with that in mind. But they need to hear more, and I hope they do during the course of the semester. Should they go on to become newspaper reporters, they'll operate in a universe in which many people understand the media to include not just newspapers, not just broadcast news, but the internet, talk radio, cable television, supermarket tabloids, and possibly even Hollywood. This, for many people, is the media. And in its approach to issues and its judgment of what is news and how to present it, well, it varies tremendously widely. Within this, I would tell my students, you've got to know who you are, and you've got to have confidence in what you do. Of course, there's more. Now, one effect of this tremendous choice out here, the positive effect, is that there's availability, wide availability of information in a way there never has been before, often immediate information. Another aspect of this, either good or bad, perhaps both, is that there's choice, enormous choice, in where you get your news. And a third, which is dangerous, I think, is the velocity with which news travels now, particularly news that in no way has been checked, which may not even be news. It's rumor, it's innuendo, and it's out there like that now. And in one way or another, all media, anything that calls itself the news media or any close approximation thereof, is affected by the speed with which stuff travels, particularly rumors, and outright news. I would say to my students, too, that they're going to enter a universe in which people will try to influence them. And many of those people will be acting not out of malice, but simply on the basis of personal convictions that trump any other considerations. When I worked for the New York Times, not a day went by that I didn't receive 8, 9, 10 or more phone calls, faxes, emails, letters from interested individuals trying to persuade me to write something that in some way would benefit their cause. Now, in a few cases, these approaches concerned matters that I thought were quite legitimate and newsworthy and useful for not just my purposes, but I thought for the broader purpose of what I was trying to do, to inform the public. People let me know when someone was coming to town, to use the most obvious example, that would probably be a good person to talk to because this person had something to say of wide application and resonance. But often I was approached about matters that were extraneous to what I was trying to do, which was to provide news about religion in America. And none of this struck me as something I shouldn't expect. Those people were acutely aware of the potential value of appearing in the New York Times, also acutely aware of the potential value of appearing in almost any newspaper, any news source. But there is, of course, a darker side to being paid this attention. And I'd like my students to be aware there are people who would manipulate them, possibly at considerable cost to their reputations, and by extension to that of their colleagues. I don't think this is by any means unique to this particular profession about which I'm talking. Occasionally, one gets warnings, and I have an example from my own experience that I'll share with you. Years and years ago, I sat in a courthouse in a zoning hearing about a very controversial proposed commercial development, which was being tenaciously fought, as these things sometimes are, by a group of interested citizens who felt that it would have a negative impact on their neighborhood. At one point, a principal figure in that citizen group tapped me on the shoulder and gratuitously, just out of nowhere, decided to tell me about the group's strategy, which is fine. I was more focused on the substance of the hearing, but fine, I'm willing to listen to that. At the end of which, and he was sitting amongst his friends, he said, however, if you dare quote me on this, I'm going to call you a liar. I'm going to say you made that up out of whole cloth, and you can't be trusted. And then he sat back and laughed. He said, the press lied. And it struck me at that point that I would never trust him again. But I took his threat seriously. I had to be careful. And such things, of course, do happen. Not everyone is so open about his or her intent. And therein lies a real danger, which can create all kinds of problems, as it has, apparently, for Dan Rather. Here's Wednesday's second section of the Wall Street Journal. Forgery charges could damage CBS credibility. Now, do you all know what this concerns? That Dan Rather went on 60 Minutes and said there were two documents from the 1970s that suggested that President Bush, as a National Guardsman, got preferential treatment. And since then, those documents have been called into question, suggested that they're forgeries. Someone had an interest in putting those out there, and we don't know the full story. Maybe the full story will never be known. But there are times, of course, in journalism, and this can be found, I think, in other professions too, when something just appears too good to resist, too intriguing, too tempting in one way or another, particularly in a very competitive situation. Earlier this year, my former employer, The Times, published a highly unusual and perhaps unprecedented is a better word, statement indicating that the newspaper might have been credulous in accepting claims from a particular source or series of sources about secret weapons programs in Iraq. I don't know how many people saw that editor's note published in May. It had published many of those stories on its front page, and it's possible, just possible, that the weight of those stories published in the New York Times had enormous consequences, only some of which we have yet experienced. Was the newspaper spun? If it was, then so was an important segment of American society, i.e., here's the contagion, the virus that's loose. And that is the people who read and accepted those stories at face value. I find this stuff difficult not to take personally as someone who spent 20 years in the business. It really upsets me when I read things like this. But it should upset me as a citizen. So I'm upset maybe on two counts. Nearly a quarter of a century ago, when the term news media meant a more limited universe of outlets, and when journalists still basked in the glow of a reputation built on one newspaper's extraordinary, history-changing investigation into political corruption, by which I mean Watergate, back then a movie came out that told a dark story about the profession. In absence of malice, a newspaper reporter played by Sally Field is spun by an unethical prosecutor who leaves her alone in his office with his notes about an investigation into a local businessman. I don't know how many people ever saw that. Some, yeah. By the time the movie ends, at least 3 people, including the reporter and the prosecutor, have seen their careers destroyed. And one person, more or less an innocent bystander, caught by chance in the scandal, has committed suicide. The journalist stands accused of being foolish, a dupe, but capable of immense damage, doing great damage. It's a parable of the immense power of the media, the power that the media can have. A far more recent film, released last year, paints an even darker picture. In Shattered Glass, a movie that recounts real events, a young writer at the New Republic is revealed to be a fabulist, his word, making up entire stories and passing them off as true. His scam works for months. Similar scams have occurred, of course, at the New York Times and also at USA Today within the past 2 years. The damage they inflicted on their institutions can't be calculated. I would add here that this does not happen in a vacuum. Lies succeed as a process of seduction. A counterfeit of genuine creativity is produced by an individual, and people are taken in by it. And the success of that may work best in cultures which are particularly authoritarian, and to borrow a phrase used by the people outside editors who came in to investigate conditions at USA Today, a culture in which a culture of fear predominates, in which fear is cultivated, in which it becomes heretical to question what's going on, in which those questions are discouraged and it's seen as disloyal somehow to do that. I think lies and distortions and spin find fertile ground in cultures in which people lose touch with shared values, historic values. As I've thought about this, I've kept returning in my own mind to that question posed to Jesus during his trial in John's Gospel. What is truth? Asked Pontius Pilate. And in the Gospel, of course, he doesn't wait for an answer. And you can read that question as having been asked in bewilderment. Was it? What is truth? Or was it asked in contempt? What is truth? Either way, it has a resonance with contemporary culture and with some corporate cultures. Truth, if it exists, can be regarded as being purely personal rather than universal. Or truth is utterly elusive. In such a situation, the journalist, and I would add other professionals too, needs to identify, in cases like this, where this sort of thing predominates, what it is they fundamentally value about their work that can help them navigate through such perilous situations. What is it? What standards? What goals? Goals beyond oneself. To what is one committed? In journalism, but not just in journalism, there's a fundamental belief that information has public value and that the supply of information about public matters is important in that it can affect people's lives. And here I stress public matters because I have absolutely no interest in information about the lives of celebrities. It's on this consideration that modern journalism was founded. And it's in regard to it that legions of journalists have approached the task of reporting on government, business, and other areas that directly affect people's lives and livelihoods. That is, information itself has a value, and it should be presented with a commitment to that, to presenting information, and with a disinterest, too. A passionate interest in the process of presenting it, but a disinterest in being in any way partial. This idea, this presentation implies a relationship between the journalist and the journalist's audience that demands respect. The relationship demands respect, care, and nurture. It requires being painstaking in one's approach to gathering information, cautious in one's attempt to interpret it. And caution is very, very important. And generous in the manner in which one presents it. It also requires being willing to acknowledge error quickly, should that occur. And for that reason, for all these reasons, it's difficult work. It's made difficult, too, in a profession that, as I say, can be a lonely one because it's very competitive, because its rewards, individual rewards, can appeal directly to the ego, to one's personal pride. I think, and this is what I found in my career, that it's of immense help to find a way to establish a sense of community with one's fellow professionals and outside one's profession, with people with whom one feels free to discuss fundamental values in one's work, to discuss one's work in general. That is, people whom one can trust within one's family, within one's friends, within one's colleagues. It's not easy, but it grounds you. And being grounded, quite literally, makes it less likely that you're going to be spun if you have your feet on the ground. As I say, loneliness is it's a problem in a competitive profession. And the lonely are perhaps more susceptible to temptation. So I write this, I think of another quotation, and this is by Harry Truman, who famously said, "Tell the truth, then you won't have to remember what it was you said." It sounds so simple, doesn't it? It sounds so wonderfully simple and so neat. And in closing, I just want to say, though, that the problem is that the rewards within journalism, and not just within journalism, within other professions, can often flow to people who are not careful, who take risks that can involve duplicity. Their creativity, even if founded on very thin ground, may be mistaken for genius. I've certainly seen that happen, and in the cases in which they were exposed the blame has been widely shared. There are lots of casualties. But of course, they may not always be exposed as such, as liars or fabulous. Nor may their cases be so clearly defined. In some cases, it's ambiguous. Which leads me finally to say I wouldn't be realistic in speaking about the difficulty of creating trust in the news media and elsewhere without acknowledging that there is an element of tragedy in all this. And that is that establishing trust, working to establish trust, is a moral good, but it doesn't always guarantee temporal success. It only would if the world were a just place. And so, on that note, let me stop. And I'd be very happy to enter into a discussion. Take your questions, your comments. Yes?
Last night, Barbara Walters talked about her leaving the news show 2020 after 2 decades and just doing specials. Part of the reason being that she's over 70, and wants a little more private time. But the other being that she doesn't appreciate the change to a culture of disinterested in issues and that's really only interested in celebrities, so that people are more interested in her interviewing, TV celebrities than people of substance in public life. If you combine that with your talk about the pervasive development of culture of fear, idolizing celebrities, and I would add to that the sort of emphasis on the negative in the news media. I mean, trying to find some negative polarization story rather than the news. How do we as the public, how can we counteract that?
Well, a simple way is to interact with the news media, and I've always told people, particularly in the religious, who are involved in religious life, that is, who are particularly people who are clergy and who wanted to see more news about or acknowledgement of religion and spiritual life in one way or another, to interact with the news media, to feel absolutely free that they could pick up a phone or write a letter and begin perhaps to develop a relationship with a particular institution, local institutions being the most accessible, newspaper, television station, saying, hey, I'm a viewer, I'm a reader, I care about these issues, could I have a conversation with you? Or write a letter. And there's a way to do that without being confrontational, but in fact being being persistent and seeking to develop as an interested person a relationship. Few people take advantage of this. It is important. However, in terms of things that I would call in somehow one way or another extraneous to real news, outside of real news, i.e. celebrity diets, that's what I think of as being, really outside the news, but unfortunately, it's a part of a very, very competitive world in the media. Unfortunately, that sort of stuff does have a resonance with many people in the general public. They're fascinated with what Jennifer Lopez is doing, in terms of losing weight, if she needs to. I'm not sure she does. But again, that goes back to my earlier point. There is a way to sort of counteract that. The local newspaper where I live now, the Syracuse Post-Standard, has a very lively letters page in which people do write in and say, you just printed something that was not news, and we didn't need to know that. And it does often revolve around this fluff. Now, in terms of divisive stuff, I feel I hear what you mean, but on the other hand, I think that much that happens in our lives could be described as divisive, or it could be the way issues are debated, including right at the local level in terms of City Hall. Things that make news are often things in which there are multiple parties to a given situation. And in some cases, people get very emphatic about about sort of describing their positions. And I hold that that is news, that's very important. I think what's exploitative is when someone goes in, i.e. a journalist, with a very, very strong point of view, quotes entirely one side of something, and this is published just to see what it would stir up. But that's bad journalism, and that's just not good. I mean, that goes against what I consider a responsible presentation of issues in society in which you do strive to present different sides of what's going on. Now, the toughest thing in all this, but I think a very important thing, is to give some acknowledgement, particularly in areas that are sharply polarized, that there are people in the middle and people who will say, gee, I don't know. And one of my proudest moments at the New York Times was in reporting on a particularly divisive moment within the Presbyterian Church USA, which, surprise, surprise, they were debating the position of gays and lesbians in terms of should they ordain them. I mean, imagine Presbyterians doing that. I did actually reach some very prominent people who said, you know, I just don't know what side to take on this issue. But I take it very seriously. And I just felt that being able to get those voices in that particular story was important because they represented a wide constituency. And it wasn't in any way those weren't facile statements. Those were heartfelt statements. And somehow I think that in the midst of controversy, it's important to acknowledge that there are people many people who are just uncertain, but still looking for a way to they're interested, uncertain yet interested. Well, that's a long-winded response. Sir, in the back.
To take another film, All the President's Men, somewhat recently, Robert Redford said that he very much regretted making the film because that it seemed to make a celebrity out of the investigative journalist. And I was wondering what role that might have played in like Jack Kelly or Jason Blair's choices, and also what role did the gatekeepers like the press have in preserving things like Moltmann talked about? And if you tell the truth in a political arena, you need some vehicle for that. Is that problematic if they're not telling the truth or being fair?
It is.
The trust isn't gendered.
It is absolutely problematic. It's absolutely problematic. If the people who are entrusted in some way or other with presenting a picture of our world are unfair, or if they're liars, it's absolutely devastating. In terms of celebrity, I think we're dealing with two different instances here. I don't know how many people are familiar with the actual names, Jack Kelly and Jason Blair. Jason Blair, I don't think, became a celebrity. Jason Blair is a very unusual character. He sort of hid out and wrote these stories, but to this day, I don't know what he got out of it. Jack Kelly's different situation. Kelly's alleged fabrications went on for years, and during which time he was acclaimed, absolutely acclaimed by USA Today, nominated for a Pulitzer Prize at least 4 times, spoke at conferences all over the country. He was their star in a way Jason Blair never was. Jason Blair, I think, was favored among several people, but he was never accorded the accolades Kelly was. People did try to, if one reads this report that was written on what happened, what went wrong at USA Today, there were reporters who tried to raise questions about what Kelly was doing. How could these stories be so good? And I'll tell you, I remember clearly one of his stories about a bombing in Jerusalem. I was standing at a train station in Princeton waiting for my train up to New York, and I couldn't move until I finished the story. It was so absolutely riveting. The details were extraordinary. I'd never read anything like it. And it was just made up. There was a bombing. But in any case, it's terribly destructive. And I want to add one thing about that's very interesting and sort of contradicts a shibboleth about the news media. That is that the news media is somehow hostile to religion, which I never experienced. Never experienced, anyway. One of Kelly's former editors was quoted in the New York Times very shortly after this scandal began to break and said, she was astonished at this. She said, he was so open and talkative about his Christian beliefs. I took him as being such an ethical and moral person, which actually is it's a cultural thing in the United States. One equates personal religiosity with an ethical life. of course, that's disproven again and again. In the very back, sir.
Gustav, from a kind of an inside perspective, how is it that the Times was so misled, for lack of another word, with respect to the Iran affair?
I'm sorry, to which?
With respect to the knowledge concerning the weapons of mass destruction. And this went on for such a long time, over a period of months, advocating that position. I mean, I read the review later, you know. It's just in my mind, what was the dynamic? How did that happen at a credible newspaper? We can no longer say, I read it in the Times, I read it in the Gospel.
And if you can't say that, it's indicative of the damage that was done.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think the situation's been resolved yet, and it happened after I left. I can only speculate, but I do think that the culture that existed inside the Times for a certain limited amount of time was one that did not, shall we say, encourage as thorough a review of certain stories as it should have. I hesitate to speak, I have my feelings about this. I certainly have my suspicions, but so much remains unknown. Let me just say this, that if there's a situation in any corporation in which some people may be viewed more favorably than others, and maybe perhaps privileged, then it's, are those, can abuses happen, It's just a thought, so I hesitate to go further. Yes?
This is fascinating to me as being involved, though not a journalist, in debates about media issues both in Britain and in Ireland, because you've given us a wonderful account of the ethical journalist with professional standards, from which, however, it would be very hard to know that this is, in Britain at least, the least trusted of all professions. Newspaper journalists are less trusted, to tell the truth, than politicians. 7% of my fellow countrymen in Britain say that they generally trust newspaper journalists. Now, in part, and with all honour, American news journalism has a distinctive tradition of professionalism and ethical practice. But this is the real world. These are very powerful institutions.
Mm-hmm.
There are huge pressures on them. There is huge international consolidation of, I find it surprising that the issues can be debated as issues of the individual conscience. Elsewhere in the world, people are very worried that certain misinterpretations of press freedom are actually destroying the possibility of a press that thinks of its duty to inform as paramount. And I don't know whether you just find this remark from outer space, but it is one that we feel in much of the world.
Yes, and I think it is important that be heard. And I think it's one thing that I became increasingly conscious of. The older I became and the more I was entrusted with certain positions, and I'm not sure which was sort of mattered more to the development of this thinking, the more acutely I was aware of the power that I potentially possessed. I say potentially because I don't know. You really don't. You don't know for certain what the effect is going to be of a particular story. And here I'm talking about a newspaper reporter. You can see it sometimes. You can see it. Sometimes you may run into it months later in terms of what someone tells you about how he or she was affected by something you wrote. But this just enhanced my sense of caution. And in my case, but I question, to be quite frank, I question whether I was becoming so cautious in some ways as to be ineffective. I needed to be an interpreter, and yet at the same time, I really felt that one could only apprehend sort of a truth in part. I mean, when someone saw through a glass darkness, so to speak, and that this was a process of sort of telling a story, that there'd be another day that you'd come back to it, and another day, and you could always hope that, and that there would be more that was apparent to you as you went on. But if that's abused, if that awareness is abused, and I think there are people who do abuse it, then, well, the dangers are to society. So I think we're speaking about the same thing, and you see this in a world sense too. That the abuse of information can also be inhibiting the development of a free flow of information in other countries that may just be experimenting with this. If I understand what you're saying there. No. Would you like to clarify?
I was really inviting you to speculate a bit about the real political and economic context of the media organizations rather than the conscience of the individual journalists, which I honor and respect. But the reality, as I think we experience it in many parts of the world, which parts of the world have no more censorship than we have here, is very different.
Well, you mean the economic and political situation in which one is participating in an institution that takes for granted its existence within a free market democracy. Is that right?
I trust journalists more than Iris Murdoch.
I'm glad.
I say to you Berlusconi, I say to you Tony O'Reilly, I say to you Rupert Murdoch. That's the reality I'm asking you to speculate about, to put it in slogan terms.
The ownership. Okay, well, I mean, that's something that's one has had to deal with, I think, throughout press history. You look back at William Randolph Hearst. I mean, Hearst made people and he broke people. But I think that here, look, I'll come back to the conscience of the individual journalist. It is, it's incumbent on individuals to decide, to gain some perspective on the institutions for which they work and decide whether these are institutions that they actually believe in, and that their institutions committed to presenting a truthful, as much as one can, view of the world. I don't think I've satisfied you on this, but no. All right. Well, I'll just say this. I've had the advantage of working for publications that I basically trusted, And I mean, if that says something, that may say something about me, that I'm perhaps naive enough to trust these organizations, but I don't know quite what the alternative would be in this way, without necessarily confining oneself to some other form. But I can't imagine what it would be. Sir, you've had your hand up. Okay.
Can we trust? And I'm speaking more of the television media, less of the print media. In essence, both. Can we trust the media when they don't even seem to aspire to trust? They take on the form of entertainment. To the extent they communicate, it's only in tidbits and sound bites.
Well, you're thinking of specific media here, and I think you have to make up your mind whether you have to make up your mind what media you're willing to trust. I mean, I know.
It's got to compete with the television media.
Right.
So the pressure's on them as well.
Yes, there's always pressure, but at the same time, there's enough financial stability in sort of in many of the major important media in this country that I don't see the news judgment being utterly swayed. I mean, when I read, for example, I read the Washington Post online, and I feel like I get a pretty informed picture, particularly of metropolitan Washington, which is an interest of mine right now in terms of the class I teach, and I don't think that's necessarily being swayed by television news. Also, television news exists at many different levels. It does exist at the network level, which is pretty much, I think, what it has been for some time. It also exists at the local level, where you just have to be prepared that what you're going to get are reports of police chases and fires and, cats running up trees and weather, a surfeit of weather, and some of which is occasionally interesting. And then you've got cable, which is just this extraordinary mixed bag of things, some of which I think are handled in a way that you need to know, and others which are outlandish. And the problem is, of course, that there is a blurring of the lines, particularly when you get into newer media. And I think this is particularly the case with cable, where some people mistake these awful, awful shouting head programs for news. You know, they're appalling. But the fact of the matter is they're cheap as all get out to put on. You know, they require very, very little money to put on this sort of hour worth of just utter idiocy. And something which is totally, almost utterly demeaning of democracy. I mean, I feel total contempt for these shows. Ooh, better stop there.
Last question.
Okay, so.
One of the major dangers that I see for the TV, the main stations, is during the presidential elections and the amount of millions of dollars that go into these media for ads and, of course, the influence or the potential influence as to what that president means as far as reporting and the whole image of national TV at 6:30 at night or 7 or whatever. And I'm very concerned about that. I think newspapers have an edge of credibility in this instance more than TV media.
Thank you.
And I'm very concerned about it because just think of what that means that you can buy media. And that's serious. That's serious stuff.
Well, yes, and I mean, as I say, people are always attempting to manipulate the press, always, the media. I mean, there are people who are paid fabulous sums of money to attempt to manipulate the media, particularly in politics. And to a degree, what they put out there may be irresistible in some cases, just in terms of how a situation is set up and the message that's being delivered. But one can only hope that over time, as a particular story is told, that journalists are able to realize what's going on. Often they do, but and I think it is a particular problem in TV where the visual is so important, is so dominant. You know. Thank you very much.